Okay, Mikaela, whenever you're ready, go ahead, get started.
Hey, good morning, everybody. I'm really excited to be talking about this topic today. It's something that's kind of been a pet project of mine for several years, and even though I'm not a commercial grower of any kind, I believe that this information can be done at home. This kind of topic can be done for anybody who's interested even a little bit in native plants. So I think it's a really nice complement to what John was talking about last week with vegetable gardening. Now I'm going to do the other side, which is the more native and wildflower side. And I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera as well, just to follow suit with everybody. But I will be turning it on again later because I want to share my camera with you all. I have a little bit of demonstration and stuff to show you, so we can break up the PowerPoint just a little bit. So before we even get started, let me tell you about myself. I work out of Talbot County for the University of Maryland Extension Service. I am the Master Gardener Coordinator in Talbot County, but I also do urban horticulture for residents. But native plants and native habitats are really the thing I'm the most interested in. It's the thing I like to talk about the most. And you'll probably pick up very quickly that I could talk about native grasses all day, every day. So if you ask me a question about it, be prepared. That's all I'm saying.
I love when you get going about native grasses, Mikaela.
I love native grasses. Don't even get me started. It's too early in the presentation to get started on that. But before we even move to the next slide, Stephanie, will you bring up the first poll, please? I'm just going to make sure everybody's awake and participating. I want to make sure you're engaged today.
All right, it is launched. You guys should see the poll pop up on your screen. If you don't see it, make sure that you are clicked onto or have selected your Zoom window. So go ahead and respond to that. Good, looks like folks are seeing it.
Yeah, great. And we'll just wait just a minute or two here while people are voting. Good, everybody's quick on the draw this morning. You must be paying attention. I'm going to test you. I'll test you again later to make sure you're still paying attention as we go.
Looking good. Also, just so everyone knows, Jean has put the handout for today's lesson into the chat box. So you guys can all download it from there.
And all the handout is like an adaptation of the PowerPoint presentation into a more readable format. So if you really want the presentation in PDF form, you can have it, but the handout is a nice condensed version. And I believe I listed all the resources that are at the end of this presentation. So you're welcome to use those as you need.
Excellent. All right, so we've got 94% of people who have done the poll. So I'm going to go ahead and end it and share the results.
Awesome.
All right,
great.
So most people are looking like average. That's good.
Great. Well, that's good because I do think you need a little bit of knowledge to get started. This certainly wouldn't be a topic I would pick for beginners. But if you are a beginner, don't be scared. I'm going to help you through it, and hopefully it'll be something you'll explore yourself. And honestly, I think that's the best advice I'm going to give today is some of this is just going to be about experimenting on your own, and it's okay to fail. It's okay if you sow seeds and nothing comes up. It's all part of the process. I'm going to go ahead and get started here. So, like I said, that could be part of the reason you're collecting seed is that you're just interested in the scientific exploration of it. It could be that you're looking to save money. Maybe you're looking for a specific plant selection for your environment. There's all sorts of reasons why people want to save seeds. And this is somewhat different from vegetable gardening in that vegetable gardening, you're really looking at specific specimens and selecting specimens that will be genetically superior to other species or specimens in the garden. But native seed is almost the opposite of that. I like to say native seed collecting is for the lazy gardener because you don't have to pay that much attention to, whether this specimen's the strongest one or you're just looking for some genetic variation. You're looking to preserve that genetic diversity. So instead of excluding other genetic traits, you're actually looking to include as many as possible. So it's kind of that genetic preservation and diversity of your local area of wherever it is you're collecting. So whatever your reason may be, I think it's a worthwhile endeavor, and sometimes you're just doing it for fun. It's not a very expensive hobby. For the most part, it's pretty cheap, and you don't have to have a lot of specialized equipment, which I'll show you later. This is something that you can do just using your own garden plants. So these are some of the topics we're going to cover. We'll take a look at plant types. We're going to talk about locations, all the characteristics, and then I'll go through some of those techniques and hopefully be able to show you using my document camera how we're going to do some of that collecting, or how it would be done. And then I'm going to talk about suggested species for seed collecting, because I know that you guys are going to have a lot of questions specifically about different genuses or species. And what I'm going to tell you is that each genus and each group is a little bit different. So sometimes you treat them very differently. You can make some general assumptions, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But so when you ask me about how to grow this specific specimen, I'm going to say, well, let me check, because each species is a little bit different. Whoops, let me do that. All right. So real quick, I know you guys probably know this information already, but it bears repeating that there are different types of seeds, and it's good to recognize what species are which, because of course annual seeds are going to be ones that you're going to need to collect every year. That isn't something that's going to repopulate itself necessarily. Sometimes they may self-seed, and usually that's how they survive in nature. But that doesn't mean it's going to show up exactly where you want it to. So it may be something you have to seed every year. They don't necessarily overwinter in the same spot. And the one example I use for that is Impatiens capensis, or orange jewelweed, which is out in bloom right now. It's gorgeous. It really likes kind of wetter, rich soils, kind of in shade. But believe it or not, they don't exactly come back in the same spot every year. They just kind of reseed. And that's great for certain areas. Biennials, I don't run into a whole lot of species that are biennial with native plants. Common primrose is the one that comes to mind, Anethera biennis. And just like the name suggests, it's a biennial. So it produces all that foliage and leaves the first year, and then you'll see the flowers and seeds in the second year. And this is more often a roadside plant, so you can find it pretty easily. It really is easy to find in bloom, and then you can collect the seed if that's your purpose. And then perennials, that'll be mostly what we deal with today. These are things that grow year after year from established root system. And they may take some time to get established, especially if you're growing them from seed. They grow very slowly in the first 1 to 2 years. So don't be discouraged. And that's another thing I'll talk about today, is that if those seeds don't pop up instantly in the spring, or they don't all pop up at once, just give it time. This takes a lot of time and patience, because native plants behave very differently than the cultivated types we're used to. So before you even get started, these are some questions you should ask yourself. What kind of species are you interested in? And you should be interested in species based on your location or the project that you're planning for. Don't just collect a bunch of seed and then grow those seeds and then realize that you have nowhere appropriate to put all those plants, because first, it's sad, but unless you're going to be sharing with a lot of friends, or maybe you're doing a swap with some other master gardeners, it's really no purpose to it, other than if you're just kind of exploring. So what is your purpose? That's the second question. And then you're going to look at what kind of collection and propagation techniques are going to be needed depending on the genus and the species that you're collecting. So the plant I show in this picture, this is a native grass, of course. This is a type of Andropogon ternarius, and that's split beard stem. And I had a very dry spot that I want to establish these, and it's an area that I'm looking to stabilize the soil and prevent erosion. And as you can see, even these teeny tiny seedlings, look at the size of the root system that's growing so far. You know, the plant was only maybe 2 inches high. This was the spring. And I transplanted them already, and they're already root bound in the container that they're in, because those root systems are so substantial. And that's good, because it stabilizes the soil. And then also think about whether you have the patience and time for this. It, like I mentioned, it's a very slow process sometimes. I've had species that never germinated. And if you're really counting on the fact that they're going to germinate and you're going to use them for a project, you know, you may be finding yourself waiting for either of those plants to germinate, or you need to substitute with a different species. So just be patient with the process. If you have the time, it's super rewarding. And even if you don't have the time, it's not super hard to get started and to try. The name of that grass, Kim, was Andropogon ternarius. I can type it into the box. And I'm going to try and, well, and Stephanie and Jean, please keep me on task as far as time. We can take a break and I can answer questions as we go to it.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Thank you. So your location is going to be super important. You want to make sure you're selecting the right species for your project and purpose. On the right, you can see that's our native hardy hibiscus, which, if you know anything about it, it's very specific to the coastal plain. It likes really wet areas. Maybe it'll be okay in marsh and wetland areas, freshwater. But it tends to prefer those brackish marshes. And so don't grow something like this and then realize you live in the mountain region, you know, zone 5, and you have nowhere to put it unless you have a pond specifically made for it. But it does like to have wet feet. And another really important thing is make sure you're identifying the species correctly and early on. So don't wait until the seed head stage, because often those seed heads aren't going to look anything like the flower. And even if you're kind of good with foliage, it can really be a drawback if you're not familiar with the species. And then you're going to spend your time second guessing what it is you're collecting. And if you spend all that time growing it, it may not be what you thought it was. So that's a picture of the seed head. These are very large seed heads, and actually the seeds itself are fairly large and easy to handle. But I tend to recommend marking the plants while they're in bloom, and you can use fluorescent tape or you know, other kind of markers like flags, and just make sure you're marking those plants as specimens that you plan to collect from later. And I'm also going to talk about getting permission of property owner or entity, and I'm going to talk about this in the next slide. But avoid public parks or spaces. These are, just because they're public doesn't mean you should be taking things from those spaces. And often you know, those public owned properties have rules against collecting and taking plants. One thing that comes to mind is the National Park Service just busted somebody recently in Shenandoah for collecting, I think it was not some kind of native woodland, oh gosh, it just came, it's like a nettle. It was a wood nettle. And because it was edible, or they wanted to harvest it for eating, they got caught with bags, like garbage size bags of these plants, and they got charged. So please don't go to those kinds of properties. Private property is best, especially if you make friends with your neighbors and you make friends with other master gardeners, and you guys can kind of exchange those spaces. Roadsides are also great, but I caution you against collecting from the roadside for safety issues. So unless it's someone's driveway and you have the permission of that person, I would avoid those spaces as well. And then you want to make sure you're collecting from a large population size. And this is for genetic diversity reasons, but it's also for ethical reasons. And I'm going to talk about that right now. The reason you want a large population is because you don't want to harvest more than 5 to 10% of a wild population. And there's something called the 20 rule. And that's for every 20 seeds available, you're taking 1. And like with really small seed, that's not a lot. So, but with a larger size seed, you may be able to pay attention to that more. But honestly, you don't need a lot. So don't harvest more than you need, because those wild populations really depend on that seed distribution. And you got to have the permission from a landowner or entity. And so if you're not very familiar with the person, they aren't necessarily a friend, you may even want to have them send you an email saying it's okay for you to come onto the property, whatever it is. Just don't get yourself into hot water, because I don't want someone saying, well, Mikaela told me I could go to the roadside and that was fine. I didn't say that. you have to get permission. So don't take seeds from rare, threatened, and endangered plants. And I'm not going to talk about it in great detail, but there's a link to this, to these words, and I think I can click on it. I'm not going to open it right now, but there's a list from DNR of rare, threatened, and endangered species in Maryland for plants, and they're rated differently depending on how rare they are. I took a look at the list. I'm not sure. I've seen maybe a handful of what's on that list, so chances are you're not going to run into it. But if you do encounter those rare and endangered plants, do not collect seed from them. And like I said, don't collect from public parks, recreation areas, National Park Service. You're going to get in trouble. And do not collect from small populations, because larger populations are best for both ethical reasons and genetic reasons. And someone may ask the question, like, what constitutes a large population? Really, it's dependent on the species. Is it a commonly found species? Are you looking at one specimen per, square mile? That's probably too small. You want to make sure that you're gathering from healthy populations. If there's several small populations in the same area, you can kind of collect from those communities, but do it sparingly. Okay. So here's some ways you can also mark and protect your seeds. I'll show you an example of this, but you can use these little gauze bags. They usually sell them for like wedding favors, but they're really nice for tying around seed heads that dry and then kind of split, because when they split, you may be losing some seed or they're going to be falling on the ground. But if you tie the little bag around it, you can kind of collect and keep those seeds all in one place. It makes collecting a little bit easier down the road. The nice thing about wild columbine, and I'll just use this real quick. The nice thing about wild columbine is that the seed head is upright and it dries in these kind of like tubes. And so when you turn the tubes over and spill them out, you have these like dark little seeds. So that's a really easy one to collect. Native azalea is one I say make sure you're marking while it's in bloom, because when you come back later after bloom, you're not going to be able to distinguish that shrub from anything else. It really doesn't have any identifying features unless you're really, really good at plant ID. Even I have a hard time finding them. So this is just an example of when you would want to mark or flag that plant so that you can come and collect the seed later. I know you're going to think you can rely on your memory, but don't rely on your memory. It doesn't usually work. Okay. So in the act of collecting seed, you want to make sure you're determining your location. Is it your garden? Is it from the wild? Is it from someone else's property? And this is one thing I do all the time. Don't collect in the rain or right after the rain, because those seeds need to dry. And if it's just rained, it's going to be really hard to get the humidity out of those seeds and to get them properly dried. And like I said, I've done it, okay? I've been in a pinch and I've had to collect when the seeds were really wet, and it makes it much harder down the road. You don't need a lot of equipment. Pruners, loppers might even be excessive. Pruners, scissors, you can wear gloves if you plan to strip the seeds from the plant. Paper bags, which I'll show you in a little bit. These are usually like the lunch bags, or if you have the grocery bags, those are even better because you can collect entire seed heads. Pillowcases make good collecting apparatuses as well. And then you want to make sure you're bringing along labels and markers, because I'll talk about in a second, even though you think you're going to remember what that seed head is, inevitably you will forget. You will forget one of them. And then some optional items are those organza sachets that I showed you in the last slide, and then a hand lens. If you're not sure whether the seed has already fallen and that it's gone, a hand lens might be very handy to look into the seed head and see if there's anything left to collect. And then of course you want to make sure you have your selected specimens identified. And you're going to be looking for dry seed heads approximately 6 to 8 weeks after the bloom period. That's not a hard and fast rule, because native plants all bloom and then ripen at different times. I mean, you may have one specimen that is ready before the one right next to it. It really is very variable. You need to just keep an eye on it. That's why it's easy to collect from your garden, because it's something that's local and that you're keeping an eye on and have eyes on every day. Paper bags for collection. Seed heads should be facing down with the stems upward, and you can tie the top if you want with like a rubber band or string. You want those seed heads drying downwards so that the seeds drop and don't get caught in the chaff material. Usually I store seeds in paper bags for maybe even longer than 1 to 2 weeks, because I don't trust that they're actually dry. But you don't want to keep them in these paper bags indefinitely. You want to make sure you have to clean them and then put them in a more permanent spot. You want to remove the extra plant material. There's a lot of extra plant material that will make its way into the bags inevitably, including bugs. So, you know, don't store them inside your house. Maybe put them out in the garage if it's dry enough. I'll show you some mesh sieves. There's a lot of different sieves available out there. Some of them are really expensive and you don't really need them if you don't really want them, but I will show you an example. If you aren't familiar with winnowing, that's when you're pouring seeds and the chaff material from one bucket into another during a windy day, and you're taking advantage of that wind, pulling the chaff and the light material away from the materials being poured into the second bucket. And it's kind of a variable way for cleaning, but it is available, and if it's a windy day, it definitely does help. But you don't want to do this with seeds that are particularly fluffy and difficult to defluff, because the wind will carry those seeds away. Debearding is the process of taking the fuzz off of like a grass seed head. I don't always recommend doing it because A, it's very hard, and B, it's not necessary. So you can do that if you want. Sometimes 2 rubber mats rubbed together with seeds in between. That can sometimes debeard, but there's actual equipment in commercial cleaning that debeards that stuff as well. Organization really helps as well. Storing bags in boxes, labeled with envelopes upright in smaller boxes. This will definitely help you down the road, especially if you plan to stratify those seeds indoors in your fridge. You definitely want them organized, because then if you don't, your husband's going to yell at you for having bags of seeds all over the fridge, which, you know, I'm not saying that's happened, but it's happened. Okay. And then, you know, the process of cleaning seed can be a little bit messy. You want to line your work area with newspaper, maybe keep a bucket on hand for all the chaff. This can be done in the garage. It can be done outside if it's a nice day. Inside, you're going to find a lot of material all over for days, but that's okay too. Work with a single type of seed at a time. And then that way you won't get the mixing and crossover. And actually, I label the newspaper that I'm working on with the seed that I'm working with. And then after each species, I fold up the newspaper and I compost it. And then I lay out fresh newspaper for a new species. So this may take several rounds of cleaning, depending on how thick the seed coat may be. Depends on how much chaff material you have. You can thresh with pillowcases or a rolling pin. I'm going to show you an example of that in a second. And then, like I said, you can use the mesh sieve to separate chaff as well. So I am going to switch to my camera. Okay. So you guys can see my my desktop all right?
Yep, looks great.
All right, great. So let me show you some of the materials that I like to work with. Well, first, let me take the seed heads out. So, like I said, you don't need a lot of specialized equipment. You can use just plain pruners, hand pruners. Scissors work great as well. It might be a little bit tougher for hard stems or thick stems, but I like to keep them on hand because they're a little bit more delicate and you can be a little bit more precise. Here is just a simple lunch bag, and they're really cheap, and you get about 500 of them for like $5. So yeah, you have to be sure that you're labeling these bags as well. I recommend doing it before you even put the seed heads inside, but do as I say, not as I do. You want to have a marker for your pocket. Sometimes I carry like several in my car. This is more for long-term storage. This is like a coin envelope, and these are also pretty cheap to buy, and they're really easy to organize. And these are the things you're going to want to have on your materials. You want to label with the common name, the scientific name, the date collected, and the location. And then, you know, an optional might be details about the plant, whether it has genetic variation or what color the flower was, you know, what kind of growing conditions did you find it in? That might be very useful, especially if you decide to share with other people. And then these are the organza bags I talked about. So these are normally for wedding favors, but I buy them for seeds. And it may be something you're tying over the top of a seed head. I'm just going to use this as an example. So if this were the plant, you would tie it over. And I would label the organza seed head, organza bags if you can. But then you see as the seed starts to drop, it's contained. So this is kind of a nice way to collect seed that is prone to dropping or falling. Okay. And then these are maybe some options for long-term storage. I like glass because it's really good at keeping humidity out, but you know, plastic works too. And even plastic baggies work really well, especially if you're storing them in the fridge. I just had a plastic baggie. I don't know where it went. Oh, so you can do small little plastic bags like this. And usually if I am storing them in the fridge as a stratification technique, I'll put a little bit of damp sand in there. And depending on the size of the seed, I use a ratio of, you know, 3 tablespoons of sand for 1 teaspoon of seed. If they're larger seeds, I may use a little bit more sand. But we also use that sand to help sow the seeds later in the year, but we're not going to talk about that today, so I'll move on. Okay. So here's an example. And look, I was terrible. I didn't label appropriately, but I was in a rush. These are an example of Monarda. You want the stems facing down and the seed heads pointing down into the bag. Usually I'll tie them with a piece of rope or a rubber band or something. Oh, and I see somebody asked about the gloves. Yes, white gloves so you can see seeds on it. They don't have to be white, but if you're stripping a plant, so I'll use an example right here. This is bottle brush grass, and it's a very large seed head, and it won't necessarily hurt your hands, but wearing a glove kind of helps protect your hands, so you can just strip like that. And you'll notice, because this is the habit of native seeds, they may get stuck to your gloves. So you might want to deal with one species at a time and then wash your gloves in between. Let me go ahead and see, I didn't line with newspaper either. I'm doing all of the bad things today. Okay, so, and then here's another example. This is hibiscus seed I just gathered this year actually, and this is a very cool specimen because it is a dark pink variety as opposed to the white one we saw in the photograph. So I don't know if my camera will focus, but you can see the seed head's very large and they're fairly upright. So the seeds get stored in here. Sorry if it's not focusing very well. The seeds get stored in here. You can break them open. You can see the seed pods, but come on, refocus. Tested this earlier and it did better. So what I'll do is if I need to break those seeds out of the seed heads, I'll just fold the top of this bag and I'll use like a rolling pin or something round and I'll just do this. Okay, so it's pretty much crushed all the seed heads inside now, but hopefully that means I have a nice grouping of seeds at the bottom now. So that's my hibiscus seed. And what I would do is if whoop, there's a spider. What I would do is that I would crush the seeds like that, and then I would use a sieve for cleaning that chaff out of the seed. And I only brought 2 sieves with me, or screens. I have 5, I think, of different size. So you'll see that the grids are varying size. This is probably the one I would use for hibiscus. This is a fairly large one, but this is probably the size I use the most for most seed. And look, I even have material from last year in here. So this helps separate the seed from all that chaff material. The chaff material is literally just, it's leaves, it's pieces of stem, it's pieces of the seed head. It's nothing special. It's just a catch-all term for material that is not seed. So these are kind of helpful to have.
Mikaela,
Yeah.
is there any an issue if you just kind of leave it? Like, will it cause lower germination?
Not necessarily, although what that chaff material does is it holds on to moisture. And then you're at risk of having mold issues as you store your seeds long term. So you don't need to get it 100% clean. I usually don't, just because it's kind of impossible. But it does help. It does help.
Got it. And that was the next question too that came in. Are there any tricks to keep seeds from getting moldy in the fridge?
Yes. So one thing you can do is, especially if it's stored in the damp sand, and you start to notice mold issues, and really you kind of got to keep an eye on it. Maybe you're looking like once a week or something. If you start to notice mold, you can spray a little bit of hydrogen peroxide in there, and that helps to prevent mold from growing.
Awesome. Thanks.
And I see there's another question. Easy to find different grid screens at hardware store. You can try the hardware store. I actually bought, I bought just the screens for $30, and my husband made the frames for me. And I forget where I bought the screens, but they were a set of 5. And you can use them for vegetable seeds. You can use them for native seeds. They have just such a range of sizes. So if you're feeling handy, it doesn't have to be very expensive, but they sell like the round metal ones that stack on each other, and those go for like over $100. So you know, how much do you want to invest in it?
Right.
And Jennifer said, do you have problems with hibiscus seeds being buggy? Yeah, I have problems with bugs in my seeds all the time, which is why it's kind of nice to either sow them in the fall or in the winter, or if you plan to store them in the fridge, those bugs will, you know, likely be die from the cold or something. So yeah, you just have to. And so I brought an example with me, like I said, these are bottle brush grass, and these are kind of nice because they're easy to clean. There's no real chafe material. You just kind of strip the seeds, but you will notice that they have these super long awns. They're called awns, and they don't really serve any purpose for the seed, maybe for distribution. But you know, they aren't necessary for germination. So sometimes if I have a seed head like this, I'll take my scissors and I'll cut the awns off, because sometimes the awns can make it really difficult to sow them because they stick up so much. So it's hard to get good soil to seed contact. So I'll just sometimes cut them off. So now you'll see they're a lot shorter and it's a lot easier to handle. So I'll go ahead and actually those are kind of tough on the hands. So wearing gloves might be a really good idea. Okay. Noreen, I think that's where I got my screens, is Southern States Seed Company, but I'm not endorsing any one company. I'm just saying that's where they might be available. Okay, let me get back to the presentation. I don't think I had anything else to show you guys. Give me a second here as I switch over. Okay, everybody can see me again, right? So those are just some examples of how you can clean seed. Here are some easy to collect seeds that I might recommend for people. Blue flag iris has a really large seed, and it has this really large seed pod that's very recognizable, very easy to collect, and very easy to clean. Really, you just need to make sure the seed head is cleaned, but there's no special seed coat or pappus on top of the seed itself, so it's fairly easy to clean. Sallow sedge is the same way. There's really nothing to clean on this. I will talk about sedges in a second, so hold that thought, but sedges in general are pretty easy to collect. And columbine, wild columbine is a great one to start with because you get really good germination rates with columbine. They're a very easy self-seeder. And here's another list, although I included this list in the resources and in the handout, so you don't need to go ahead and write them down. They're just something to note. And again, the type of species you're planning to collect, it will depend on what time of year you have to collect them. While fall is a really great time, this is a perfect time to start collecting some native seed. There are some species that need to be collected earlier. Maybe they're blooming in the spring, and so you collect them in the summer. Lyre leaf sage is a great example of that. That's another easy one to collect. But you also want to pay attention. Some of these species are prolific. And what I mean by that, they can be aggressive self-seeders. And that's what makes them so easy to grow from seed, is that they're adapted to do that. So just be aware that if you put those on your property, you may have new ones pop up that you didn't plant. You also want to pay attention. So there are some seeds that require special techniques. Swamp milkweed is one of them. This is one that you may need to collect the pod or to rubber band the pod before it breaks open and flies away, because those silks are really difficult to clean off individually. If you can get them as a whole, you can almost strip the seeds from the silks right away. So this is actually a great stage to do that. I have fairly good success with swamp milkweed seeds, but I have less success with the common milkweed. And I'm not sure if it's my techniques or if it's the way it behaves, but swamp milkweed is a good one to start from seed. Pawpaws are an example of something that needs special techniques. It's a seed that is hydrophilic, and what that means is that it doesn't like to dry out. So they need special storage, and they need to be handled properly, because some seeds require the process of acidification. So in other words, it needs to be consumed by something or someone. And the stomach acids of that, whatever is consuming them, needs to break down the seed coat and rake away all of those inhibitors that might be on the seeds. And so maybe I don't recommend starting with pawpaw, but it's an example of seeds that do require some special treatment. And this isn't, seeds with, this is called a pappus. And all that term means is that's the fuzz on top of the seeds, which make them very difficult to clean, and makes it very difficult to keep your workspace very tidy. You can see somebody working with, I believe that might be New York ironweed, or it might be groundsel, I can't remember. So it may not be worth trying to clean that pappus material off of the seed. You may just want to store it and then just tolerate that the pappus is going to be part of the seed. And another reason why you don't want to collect in the rain is those pappuses will hold on to moisture. So you don't want to store that moldy seed. So just be aware. This is New York ironweed, of course. Its name is for that rusty red pappus that we see. So usually they're pretty easy to identify. Golden groundsel is another one that has that kind of feathery pappus. There's a lot of seeds. All of the Asteraceae usually have a pappus attached to the seed, as well as goldenrods. So here are some examples of seed heads. Over here on the left, that's Panicum virgatum. And it's a pretty easy seed to collect and clean because it really doesn't have any chaff material on it. I didn't bring one in with me, but usually it's one that you can bang against your palm or a tarp or something, and you'll see the seeds kind of fall off. That's what we call the shatter point. So when those seeds start to fall off like that, they've reached that shatter point, they're ready to collect. And they turn this really tan, light brown color. So you want to make sure you're collecting when the seed is ripe. If you collect too early, you could impact your germination rates. Here in the center, this is bone set. And this is one that's really good at self-seeding. So be careful. If you put it in your garden, it will show up everywhere. I happen to really like that it shows up everywhere. But, and that's because, that pappus helps distribute the seeds. It takes advantage of the wind, so it carries the seeds. Just the way that seed heads develop influence how they're spread, or, you know, vice versa. So if you have something like this where it's that fluffy seed head, you may want to use an organza bag or something to contain it so the wind doesn't take them all away. And then over here on the right, this is woolgrass, which is a misnomer. It's not actually a grass, but the reason it's called woolgrass is because the seeds are so woolly. They have this really fuzzy texture to them and a great color, which those seeds will hang on for most of the winter. So it's a tricky one to collect, but it does do very well germination wise. Okay, so like I said, you want to take care of your collected seed. You spent all that effort doing it, so you might as well try and keep it clean and keep it right. So coin envelopes are a great size for most seeds, especially if you plan to gift them to fellow gardeners, or, you know, they make really cool gifts for people, especially if it's a plant that has special meaning. Or you can mix them in damp sand in a plastic baggie for stratification in your fridge. Make sure you're labeling that plastic baggie, because I often forget. And then you really don't know what you're dealing with. And then I mentioned this before, you want to label what the plant is, where it was collected, and the date it was collected. And then the optional is that you have any characteristics that maybe the plant exhibits. And then to store them properly for long term, you want to make sure they're dry. So you know, low humidity. If it's high humidity in the area that it's drying, it may take more time. But the fall is a great time for drying seeds because that humidity tends to drop out. You also want to make sure that you can keep it away from insect pests or animals. You know, you mentioned bugs earlier. Sometimes bugs can be a real issue with seeds, particularly the swamp milkweed. You can get a lot of like weevils or something drilling holes into the seed itself, and those are not viable then once they've been tampered with. And then, you know, mice could be an issue. So if you store them in your garage, make sure they're sealed so that the mice don't get into your seed stores. And then you want to make sure they're stored out of direct sunlight. That really does affect, you don't want them germinating early. Okay, should I answer seeds or take a break? Answer seeds, I'm sorry. Should I answer questions or take a break right now?
Yeah, we're about halfway through, so that would be really great. We've just got 2 questions that we didn't get to so far. The first one is there a resource for the specific storage needs of different seeds? Like which ones require stratification and other information?
Yes, and I have examples of them right now, so I can switch over to my camera again. Hold on. Okay. And I'll mention these again at the end, so you don't need to like write them down or anything. They're definitely available. So these books are like my seed saving Bible. So this is a William Kalina book, and he has 3 different albums. This one's for wildflowers. I also have this one for native grasses, but I haven't really done any research about ferns and moss. They definitely behave differently. But in the backs of these books, let me show you real quick. So in the backs of these books are like an appendix, and it shows you, if I can orient myself here. So it shows you each genus and what they are, best time to collect, and then kind of different recommendations for how they should be treated. So you'll see for a lot of these grasses, it just says A, and that's because A means seed will germinate within 4 weeks if sown at 70 degrees. So most grass seeds don't need stratification. It's just saying if you have a warm enough soil, they'll germinate. But, and I'll mention this a little bit later, grass seeds, I often put them into cold period anyways, because that's what nature does. So you might get better germination that way. But yeah, so this is a whole appendix about how to treat those seeds, the best way to collect, best time to collect, and you know, whether any stratification is needed.
Awesome. That's a fantastic resource. Thanks for sharing.
Oh, they're super good. And you know what? They don't print the book anymore, so sometimes they're really hard to find. But if you email me with a specific species that you're looking at, I'll look it up in my book and I'll share it with you. Okay.
Awesome. Okay, and
I'll go back now.
another question we have for now before we break is, can you please explain the purpose of the damp sand? It sounds like it would make it hard to separate the seeds later or could possibly lead to mold.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I only store the seeds in damp sand when I know I'm going to be ready to sow them either this winter or in the spring. I wouldn't store that, like if you're not ready, like your project isn't going to be until 2022. Yeah, you don't want to store them in damp seed right now or damp sand right now. You would want to wait till later. But that's how I stratify my seeds, is with the damp sand. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And then that way, so all you're doing, and you'll see in this picture even, I just sow the sand with the seeds in it on top of the soil, and it does really nice even distribution.
Awesome. Good. All right. So, and we did all the other questions prior to now. So since we're halfway through, folks, we're going to take a little bit of a break. We'll take 5 minutes, and I've got 10:48. So let's come back at 10:53 and we'll keep going.
All right. Sounds good. We do have a class in November that a master gardener and I are going to do together about native seed sowing. So I'll advertise for that later.
Great. All right, let's keep going. Sounds good. Thanks.
All right, awesome. All right, so what kind of seeds should you collect? Just because seeds are available, sometimes that doesn't mean it's the best way to propagate. So we're going to take a look into what seeds you really do want to collect, and maybe some that you might want to pass on. An example of something that might be what you want to collect are hard to find species. So this is a native bean, a pink fuzzy bean it's called. It's very cute, and it kind of acts like a little vine. You can see this is kind of its growing habit. And that's going to be one that you won't be able to find commercially. It may be difficult to find. So that might be a good specimen for collecting. And of course, this is another one you're going to want to mark because the seed pod is going to look different much later on. And maybe some of the reason you're collecting is because you see a genetic variation that you really like. So these are 3 different specimens of the same species. This is Hibiscus mosquetos, our hardy native hibiscus. And even though I love all 3 of them, but this is the color, that dark pink color is the one I collected. I showed you in the document camera. And the reason I collected it is because the color was so outstanding. So I'm really hoping to grow those and replicate that color. So you're kind of preserving that genetic variation. And here's one that's kind of in between, where it was kind of pink, but it still had that distinctive dark pink eye. And here's another example of some genetic variation we find. Every once in a while, great blue lobelia will put out a white lobelia variation. Actually, I prefer the purple color anyways, because I think it's more striking, but some people really like the fact that this white variation is unique. And so they'll collect seeds from that to preserve the genetics. But there are other methods that may be more useful to you as you're looking at different species. You'll notice I don't talk a lot about trees and shrubs, and that's because growing trees and shrubs from seed can be a really long process. If you don't have time to do perennials, you definitely don't have time to wait for the hardwoods and the woody plants. But that's because a lot of them are really much easier to transplant. So here we have a liriodendron, a tulip poplar that's actually growing in a crack in the sidewalk. So this would be a really good candidate for transplanting. And then that way you don't have to worry about the seed germination. These pop up everywhere. So it probably isn't worth your time to actually deal with the seed itself. And hollies are another one. They're very slow growing, but they're really prolific self-seeders. So if you have a woodland and you have hollies in your woods, you'll definitely start to see seedlings, maybe make friends with other master gardeners so you guys can do a woody plant swap. So you want to make sure that seeding sometimes isn't the technique that you want to go with. This is another method to the madness. Layering is a common practice with a lot of the shrubby species that have those arcing branches that touch the ground. Often in times where they touch the grounds, they'll start to develop roots, And then you'll be able to snip off that branch that's kind of developed these roots, and you'll have a whole new plant. So, you know, growing from seed might not be a good option because you have this layering practice that speeds up the process. And there's other propagation methods for perennials as well. Blue-eyed grass, while you can deal with the seed if you want, they tend to clump, and they're very easy to divide, and then you have tiny plants that you can spread to other areas, and then those clumps will spread. And so sometimes that division is probably a better practice than collecting the seed, just because you're cutting out that time where you're waiting for germination and waiting for the plants to get big enough. So that's a really good candidate for dividing. And then there are even some perennials that you can do cuttings. Foam flower, actually in Kalina's book, he recommends propagating them by cuttings. So you're actually propagating stems versus trying to grow them from seed, because they also will spread laterally, so they'll kind of spread out. So, you know, this is why it's important to understand which species you're intending to propagate and what the best method is, because you don't want to waste time with the seeds if that's not the best method. And here are some common self-seeding types. So here's that jewelweed I talked about earlier. This is our native annual, and it's just gorgeous. You don't see that color very often in nature, and they're really striking. They've got a very like squishy herbaceous stem. They're kind of interesting. So it's a native impatiens versus the impatiens you buy in the store. Rudbeckia laciniatus this is cutleaf coneflower. This is one I would caution you to use sparingly, because it will self-seed very easily, and it will pop up pretty much everywhere. It says it likes wet areas, but I see it growing in super dry areas as well. So it's not discriminatory. It will just pop up everywhere, which, if that's the purpose you want to use it for, like you're creating a wet meadow or something, that's great. This is a perfect specimen for that. And then I actually like that the swamp milkweed spreads, it will self-seed pretty freely in an area if given the chance. And I actually appreciate that it does that, because they have such lovely blooms, and they're not a spreading plant, so it's a very upright kind of one single stem perennial, so that they don't overwhelm an area. So it's something that I usually leave in place unless I need to transplant it for a reason. So what should you start with? If you're new to this, you want to start with something that's easy to collect, easy to clean, and easy to grow. And I'll go through maybe some examples, but the list that I provided in the handout is definitely one that fits these criteria. Oh, grasses. You knew I was going to talk about grasses sometime today. So I showed you the bottle brush grass seed head. They're fairly easy to grow from seed, as long as you can get that good soil to seed contact. Here's the split beard blue stem. I showed you that really tiny one in a photo earlier, and now I have an entire tray that's actually spilling over. I do have to plant them now that the weather's a little cooler. But they have these beautiful seed heads. You can see in this picture, this is October, and even though they kind of drape over, it makes a very beautiful picture. It almost looks like a sea of seed heads. Very beautiful color. And you know, grasses are ones that rarely need stratification, but you need to make sure you have a positive ID on the plants before collecting and growing. I've had many grassy weeds make its way into my containers, and I don't notice them until they start to go to seed, until I see the seed head. So make sure you're gathering very carefully. Make sure you've correctly identified what the grass is. They can be very difficult to ID, so that's my only tip. Like I said, you don't need stratification, but often it doesn't hurt. Grasses grow through winter just like everything else. And it doesn't inhibit their germination. So I often will give them that stratification. And what do I mean by that? So stratification is a period of 45 to 60 days of cold. So it's temperatures, you know, that are, I believe it's 50 degrees or lower, maybe it's 45 or lower. So the fridge does that. That's a very consistent stratification. Or if you really want to do it the easy way, and I'm all for easy, you sow your seeds in the winter. You sow them in November or December, and then you just leave those seeds out over the winter in their pots. And they usually have adequate moisture because we have a fairly wet winter. So you don't need to worry about watering them, and they get that stratification without having to crowd your fridge. So if you want to do it right away, sometimes that's easiest. Then you don't have to worry about cleaning and storing your seed. You can just sow them right away. You also want to make sure that your seed heads are dry and brown. You want to make sure they're ready. I think somebody asked me about harvesting seeds too early.
Yeah, there was in the chat box the question
Yep.
about harvesting seeds a little too early in germination. Can you comment about this related to native plants?
Yes. So I know it can impact the germination rates for native plants. If you gather when the seeds are too green and they're not ready to drop, your germination rates will be drastically less. In fact, it may be zero. So that's why I say wait for that dry brown seed head stage, 6 to 8 weeks from after they're done blooming. And if you're in question whether they're ready or not, usually it's that shatter point I talked about. So you bang the seed head against your hand, and if the seed heads are dropping into your palm, they're ready. Does that make sense? I hope. Okay.
Yes.
So, you know, before I get too further into grasses, understands that there are warm season grasses and cool season grasses. And all that means is that there are species that prefer warmer, hotter climate versus seeds that will bloom and can mature early in the season because they prefer the cool season. So Alimus hystrix, or that bottlebrush grass I've been talking about, that's a cool season grass. It blooms early. That's why its seed head is ready right now, versus a lot of the other warm season grasses, which the seed heads aren't ready. They're just blooming right now, and they won't be ready until late October, November. So you want to make sure that you understand which grass that you're looking at, and that will influence greatly what time of year you're going to be harvesting it. I know I talked about debearding a little bit. So here's an example. This is Andropogon virginicus in the photo, and the beard is all of this fuzzy material. So when it's on a grass, we call it a beard. And it's really not worth trying to clean that beard off because it's just so difficult to do. And if you're not selling commercially, you really don't have to. So when you're collecting, don't necessarily worry about debearding. They can be really difficult to clean. Okay, sedges. Sedges are in a different family, even though we call them grass-like, and sometimes they're mistaken for grasses. They grow very differently. Their seed heads don't necessarily need to be cleaned. They just have these columns right here. And actually, if I touch those seed heads, they'll almost like fall apart. They almost shatter in your hand. So that's how you know that sedges are ready, is when they have this dry brown seed head stage. And if you touch them, they kind of crumble. And I've had fairly good success with sowing sedges in general. They do fairly well. I'll show you in a second the one inhibitor that you might run into. So some carex are hydrophilic, and I think I mentioned this word before. It just means that they don't like to be dried out. And that makes sense because sedges grow in pretty moist environments generally. So my suggestion is either to sow them right away. So you sow them so that they're going through stratification this winter, or you store in damp sand in a plastic bag, and that will help prevent it from drying out. I do recommend cold stratification for sedges. It's just a good practice. If you're in question, I say just give it a cold period or a winter period because it doesn't hurt. Native plants go through that in general, so can't hurt. The one thing about sedges is you'll notice that they have this papery coating. Actually, the seed is inside this papery coating. And this is called, you don't need to know this, it's called the perignium. And all it is that little papery material. You can clean that off for better germination, but I have found that you don't need to do that. It doesn't prevent you from getting good germination rates. So for the sake of simplicity, I say don't worry about it. And of course, flowering perennials, the bulk of what you're probably looking at and collecting are perennials. And these are the ones that are a little bit more difficult, just in terms of each species may need different treatment. So Amsonia here, this is a great one to actually start with. They sow very easily by seed. And for those of you who have them in your garden, you may notice they self-seed anyways. So transplants might be a good option. And they have these long cylindrical seeds that are pretty easy to handle, pretty easy to identify. The allium here, this is nodding onion on the right, and this is the seed head I just collected the other day. They really stink, so be careful if you collect the seed head. They are one that are a little bit more trickier. So alliums are a little more persnickety. They like periods of warm to cold, moist stratification. So they need a little bit of moisture. So this is a plant where you may need to wait several seasons or maybe even several years for them to germinate. I know some people have had great success with self-seeding in the garden and then using transplants. So just if you're interested, that might be a better method. So I see there's some questions about storing in damp sand. And hopefully I can clear it up a little bit. So the only time you're going to store in damp sand is if it's a hydrophilic seed, so it doesn't want to dry out, or if you're planning to sow those seeds in the spring. If you're not ready for those seeds to be sown in the spring, if you're not ready for them for next year, you want to store them in dry storage. So that's where you would use the coin envelopes I mentioned earlier, or like glass or plastic bottles. But the damp sand helps if you plan to germinate them next spring. Does that make sense? If you don't refrigerate it, won't it start to germinate? Not if they're dry, because a lot of seeds need the moisture and they need light to germinate. And if you deprive them of that, they'll store dry for a little bit longer. I hope that helps clear it up. So here are some baby columbine seeds. This is one I like to start with because it does so well germinating, and it's pretty easy and identifiable to use. So these are just teeny tiny columbine seedlings. And once they start to get big enough, I'll take them out of this pot and I'll separate the very small root systems and I'll put them in cells. So they'll be in much larger growing cells. So like I said, you're going to have a lot more variation in perennials, in flowering perennials as far as treatment and collecting is concerned. So that's when you might need to consult a reference online. And even though I showed you the books, I saw somebody looked it up and they were really expensive. You don't necessarily need the books. Sometimes this information is just available online. And I think my next slide is about resources. So I'll talk about that. So really, it's all going to be dependent on your genus and your species that you're trying to collect. Most require that cold, moist stratification, okay? If you're in question, just give it the moist, cold stratification because that's what winter does. You know, don't try and outsmart Mother Nature. She wins every time. Some of these seeds require scarification, which is an entirely different process. That's usually the use of hot water or some kind of acid-based solution to break open the seed coat that's particularly hard. But all of the species I suggest trying first don't require scarification. So don't get too hung up on that word unless you're going for more advanced seed collecting and seed growing. There is some hybridization of species. That's where you get the genetic variations. You know, in some cases you want that hybridization. So that could be the mixing of different heights or growing conditions that they prefer, that genetic material that you're trying to collect. You just want a wide variety because you'll get better chances of survivability. And realize that even though I may say, you know, purple top grass grows and it reaches a height of 3 to 5 feet, there's lots of variability in the genetics that you're collecting. And that variability also is affected by what kind of growing conditions you're providing a plant. So purple top can grow up to 5 feet in very optimum conditions. But if it's growing on the roadside where the soil is really poor, it's really dry, even though it can grow in those conditions, it may be a lot shorter. So just understand that native plants have that wide variability. That's partly why we love them, because they're able to survive, they're able to thrive in our native habitats. But if you're expecting a certain outcome, you know, don't be too disappointed if it doesn't come out the way exactly how you thought it was. So there are the books that I recommend. Those are the ones I have. It's a little bit more, you know, knowledge that you may need, so it may be more than you're asking for, but there's definitely a lot of online resources. I definitely recommend this Xerxes Society PDF. This is about growing and using your own wildflower seed. There's actually a tallgrass prairie research center where all they do is learn about prairie plants, how they grow, how to collect them, and how to regrow them. And so they're a really great resource as well. They have an actual chart and a guide, but understand that tallgrass prairie is based out of Iowa, I think. So there's a lot of Midwest species that we wouldn't have here, but it's still a great resource. And then Pleasant Valley Conservancy also has a seed collecting chart that may be very useful for you. Okay, so don't get too hung up on these books, even though they're great resources for me to have as an educator. If you're just growing 1 or 2 species, you don't need to go out and buy them. And I'm happy to answer questions as well. And, you know, forgive me, I'm just going to do a quick plug. Here in Talbot County, we have a free seed library. And while we provide some native plants in that seed library, it's a lot of vegetable and flower and herb seeds as well. And this year we got hit kind of hard. We usually get donations from different seed companies, and they are not doing as many donations this year. And so we're in need of contributions. If anybody feels inclined to send us seeds, we would be very thankful, especially vegetable seeds. That's the one that's the most popular, and this helps provide food security for our communities. We also do a lot of education component in combination with the seed library. So we really appreciate any support. And even if you want to just check us out on Facebook and follow us, that's great too. We welcome everybody into our program. And Missy just put in the chat box where you can send seed donations to, should you feel inclined. You don't have to. And I also want to say that sometimes collecting seeds is not enough. I know that's all I talked about today, but really the end goal is that you're going to use those seeds, or you're going to give them to somebody who's going to use them. So seeds need a purpose. This is an example of winter sowing, where you're taking that seed, you're mixing it in the damp sand I keep talking about, and then you spread a thin layer on top of potting mix media, and then you just leave them out over winter, and they start to, well, most of them start to germinate in the spring. I can't promise all of them will, but usually I have pretty good success with this. You'll see this photo right here. There's like a mesh container over the top of the pots, and that's to just keep rodents and other animals from digging into the seeds and disturbing them. That's all that it does. And it's okay if they have a little snow and a little moisture. That's what they want. That's their native seeds. They can handle it. So I will also put in a short plug for a seed sowing workshop that another master gardener, Janet Mackey, and I are going to do on Friday, November 13th. And this will be about sowing those seeds that you spent so much time collecting. So if you're interested, go ahead and register. Obviously, you don't have to. I'm just putting this out there. And I think that's it. That's all I had for presentation today. I wanted to make sure that there was enough time for questions.
That was awesome. Thank you so much. We do have a couple questions coming in the chat. So folks, if you have questions that you didn't get to ask already, I know we did get to a lot of them, which is great. But please continue to put them in the chat if you'd like. Let's see, got a couple comments about the seed libraries and people just figuring out if they have one in their counties or not. And I've been to Mikaela's seed library and it's so amazing. I highly recommend.
Well, huge props to our Master Gardener seed library coordinator, who is Missy Corley. She's actually on today. She does a fantastic job making sure it's stocked and making sure that we're responding to people who have questions about it.
Awesome. Thanks, Missy.
Yeah, huge thanks to Missy.
We had someone ask if the pink hibiscus seeds will be at the library and commented that they have a yellow hibiscus to contribute.
Oh, cool. You know what? If I have more than I need, I may put them in the seed library, but at this moment, I'm not planning to. I'm hoping to grow them.
Awesome. And Jean did put the link in the chat box for your native seeds presentation that you're doing, so folks can register there if they're interested.
Okay, and someone said they couldn't find registration. It might be that it's missing the HTTP, I don't know. But that link should work. I just tested it, it should work.
Okay. Great.
And look, I realize that this is a really big topic. I mean, I tried to cover every native plant there ever was. If people have specific questions about a species in particular, please feel free to email me. I'm happy to try and work it out with you. And I may tell you that it's not worth collecting the seed, that, you know, there's a different method that might work better. So feel free to reach out to me as well.
Awesome. We had one question again about the library. Can you send leftover seeds to the library?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure what you mean by leftover seeds, like if you had an open packet that you never finished. But yes, we gladly accept contributions.
Awesome. Good. Okay. And we got to everything else throughout the presentation. So
I think I had one poll left. I'm sorry, I just remembered.
You do.
Okay, cool.
All right, so I will go to the post webinar and we will launch the poll. So folks, before you head out, please go ahead and take the poll. Just really quickly, again, it should be popping up on your screen. If you don't see it, make sure that you're clicked on to the Zoom window on your computer or on your tablet. And
well,
so
thank you. I just want to thank everybody for joining in.
Absolutely.
You know, I love talking about this topic, and I'm happy to talk to you guys more about it if you have questions.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Mikaela. This was a lot of fun. I know I learned a lot. A lot of folks are saying the same thing in the chat box. So really, so much appreciate this. It was really, really fun. And for everyone else, we will be processing this recording for the event and then posting it on HGIC's YouTube channel, and we'll share the link with everybody who attended. We'll also share in that follow-up email a link for an evaluation for Mikaela's presentation today, which was excellent. Sure, she'll receive some wonderful comments on that, but that really helps educators to maintain their good standing with the university. So if you just have a minute when we send out that email, please fill out the evaluation for Mikaela. And all of the resources that Mikaela shared with you guys for today, we'll have links to those so you can get them from our follow-up email as well. All right, so we've got 90% and looks like the responses have slowed. So I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll.
Super pleased with the results of that poll. Thank you all.
Okay. So, and Mikaela, I'll send you all the info from today's meeting.
Perfect.
Okay, all right, I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording.